The barricade came up because, well, we're being serious now.
Tonight, Winnipeg's main landfill is closed down again due to blockades.
At this point, I haven't made a final decision.
Plus, the ousted national chief bides her time.
This needs to be resolved, and it needs to be resolved as soon as possible.
And finally, the clock is ticking on a Métis residential school claim.
Good evening, Tansei Anine. Welcome to APTN National News. I'm Daryl Stranger.
And I'm Leanne Sanders. The city of Winnipeg has once again closed a landfill. The closure is in response to a blockade set up by a First Nations warriors group and the family members of women murdered in Winnipeg.
The Brady Landfill is where the partial remains of 24-year-old Rebecca Contois were discovered in May of 2022. It is also where the body of Linda Beardy was discovered by police, who ruled her death was not a homicide. The group is barricading the road to the Brady landfill after the province of Manitoba announced a search for the remains of Morgan Harris, Mercedes Myron, and Buffalo Woman is not feasible. Their remains are believed to be at the Prairie Green landfill north of the city of Winnipeg. All four women were believed to be the victim of a serial killer who is currently in jail. Premier Heather Stephenson says the health risks to workers are too high with no guarantee remains will be found. Trey Delarond is part of the group camped at the landfill. He says the blockade will remain until a search happens, even if that means the group searches themselves.
The barricade came up because, well, we're being serious now. This is what we did back in December. You can offer support by giving us the equipment, because it was last year that they said it was up to us to search for our missing, and so now we're doing it, but we need the equipment, and they're concerned about some sort of health issues, and that will give us the equipment, give us safety gear, give us things that will, protect us.
Now, we'll have a little more on this story coming up later in the show with our Truth and Politics panel with Carrie Benjo and Nigon Sinclair.
We want to hear what you think about this story. Here's how to continue the conversation. Send your emails to news@aptn.ca. Leave a comment on aptnnews.ca. You can also find us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, and TikTok. Follow APTN News to join the conversation and see our latest stories. First Nations leaders from across the country head to Halifax, Nova Scotia next week. It's for the Assembly of First Nations summer meeting. Over the course of 3 days, delegates will debate and vote on various resolutions. But the meeting comes on the heels of the decision to oust National Chief Roseanne Archibald. APTN's Fraser Needham has more.
There are currently 45 resolutions on the agenda, but there will likely be more. One resolution calls on the AFN to challenge the recently introduced federal legislation on Métis self-government. Another calls for an independent inquiry into forced apprehensions of First Nations newborns. And yet another calls for a royal commission on First Nations deaths in police custody. But overshadowing the event will be the recent removal of National Chief Roseanne Archibald. At a virtual meeting on June 28th, chiefs voted to remove her as national leader, based on the findings of an external human resources investigation into alleged harassment of AFN staffers. But Archibald is holding firm, saying the move is a smear campaign based on her efforts to make the AFN more financially accountable. In an online video posted to Facebook on Thursday night, she says she has still not decided whether or not she will attend the assembly in person.
At this point, I haven't made a final decision. I'm leaving it open, but I'm waiting. Tonight, we're also sending a memo to the chiefs across Turtle Island, and I want to see what the feedback will be from them on whether I need to go to Halifax and be there in person.
The AFN also said it plans to have an interim national chief in place by Sunday. Fraser Needham, APTN National News, Ottawa.
2 Mi'kmaq people have been appointed to the Canadian Senate as independent senators. Both have ties to the Assembly of First Nations. Judy White of Flat Bay, Newfoundland will represent that province. She's a former CEO at the Assembly of First Nations and served as Director General at Indigenous Services Canada. Paul Prosper, a former chief of the Buckingeg Mi'kmaq Nation, will represent Nova Scotia. Prosper is the former Assembly of First Nations regional chief for Newfoundland and Nova Scotia. He has been acting spokesperson for the AFN during the infighting at the organization that has recently led to the ousting of National Chief Roseanne Archibald. The AFN congratulated Prosper today and said he assumed the role as senator on Thursday. Dan Christmas was the first Mi'kmaq senator appointed in 2016 and retired earlier this year.
It appears things may be finally moving for survivors of the Isle La Crosse Residential School in northwest Saskatchewan. They've been waiting years for compensation. Ottawa says it wants to settle its financial liability for the school. All that stands in the way is the Saskatchewan government, which still needs to come to the table. APTN's Fraser Needham has this story.
At an event on Parliament Hill last month, Jim DeRocher expressed the sentiments of many who once attended the Catholic-run residential school.
And I'm a day school survivor, 10 years. And we need to try and do something. I've got to make a plug for Isle La Crosse because we need to settle Isle La Crosse. And those people that are here that can make that happen are here today.
The federal government seems to be listening, and Crown Indigenous Relations Minister Mark Miller had this to say last week.
The Government of Canada is willing to step up to the plate and settle its portion of the liability with survivors and support their claims against the government of Saskatchewan. But it's work that ideally should be achieved around the negotiating table. These are people that are aging, and they deserve compensation and deserve some closure.
But the Isle La Crosse Residential School is complicated. At different times, it was funded by both Ottawa and the province, operated as a day and boarding school, and was attended largely by Métis students. Lawyer Margaret Waddell says these are just some of the reasons why the school was not included in the 2006 Indian Residential Schools Settlement Agreement.
And because Isle La Crosse was being operated in its for a large period of time by the Saskatchewan government, and the most of the population were Métis. They weren't included on that list, so they fell through the cracks.
Waddell's law firm, Waddell Phillips, is in the process of taking over a dormant class action suit on behalf of survivors of the school. Next month, the firm goes before a Saskatchewan judge to seek certification. But as Métis Nation Saskatchewan Vice President Michelle Leclerc points out, time is running out for survivors.
This needs to be resolved, and it needs to be resolved as soon as possible. I mean, look, the residential school closed in, I believe it was 1974. 72, 74. So the youngest of the survivors are in their mid to late 50s. So it's and then the oldest survivors are, in their 90s.
Both Ottawa and the MNS accuse the Saskatchewan government of dragging its feet and refusing to come to the table. In an emailed statement to APTN News, an official with Saskatchewan Justice said they could not comment because litigation against the government regarding the school is before the courts. Fraser Needham, APTN National News, Ottawa.
All right, we do have to step aside for a brief break, but we still have plenty more news still to come.
Coming up, our panel is here to weigh in on the landfill search question. Back after this.
Welcome back to APTN National News. We have once again assembled our regular Truth and Politics panel, Carrie Benjo and Nigan Sinclair.
This week, the province of Manitoba.
Carrie Nigan, thanks again for joining us today. Carrie, we'll go to you first. So there's not going to be a search of the landfills. Is that just a practical move, something the families didn't want to hear, but something that has to be said in spite all of the sentiment?
I can't help but think about what recently happened. We had billionaires in a submarine. They were advised not to do it. Searches were like, it's like finding a needle in a haystack. Is not looking for Indigenous women in these landfills a needle in a haystack. I think the priorities the government has set forth are quite clear with that statement. They're not willing to risk their people to look for our people, and that's what I am hearing from this statement. And it was said, and it's not what the families want to hear. Maybe the government should really take a step back and put themselves in the position of these families. Would they want to hear this news in such a manner?
And Nigan, to you now. So now the reason given is the safety of workers and no guarantee of finding any remains. Is that legitimate?
Well, there's certainly resources that can protect people when they search landfill sites. It's not easy work. The feasibility study that was published in May says that, but it also says it is possible. And there was an anthropologist with experience in forensic studies like this. So it's certainly not an issue that's quite acceptable to say things like, oh, there's health and safety concerns. I think Carrie's right. There's very little will on the government to do this. But there's also ways in which the government could have, from the very beginning, posited this so that it wasn't so harmful, didn't create more trauma. Just by simply using the word feasibility alone indicates that you're trying to decide the cost of human life or human remains. From the very beginning, both the Winnipeg Police and the Manitoba government have bungled this in so many different ways and shown a lack of sensitivity for the families, because I think the families are also realistic. This is not an easy search, and I think if it was handled in a way that was much more kind, like, for example, they also announced yesterday that a memorial will be built for these women. That's a step in a good direction, but unfortunately it's drowned out by the kind of insensitivity and dehumanization language that's used.
And back to Carrie, so going back to the reaction of the families, that the province and the city don't care and that their family members should not be disposable, what are your thoughts on that?
Going off what Nigan just mentioned, I think there should be some sort of inclusion. You know, the government needs to reach out to the families and include them. Let them know that their concerns and what they're feeling is valid. I think right now, by them taking a step back and not including them in these decisions moving forward is creating this rift, and it's getting further and further apart, because the optics of it, what's being played out on social media is this government doesn't care, and the government's like, okay, well, you know, there's this cost. But you know what? If from the start, if they engaged with the family, you know, brought them in, talked to them, you know, and worked out a plan and had maybe the family's input leading this announcement, maybe it wouldn't be so harsh. You know, right now it's just like, okay, we made this decision. Okay, yeah, we're sorry, but let's move on, kind of thing.
And finally, Nigan, what should happen?
Well, I think that the statement last evening of Premier Heather Stephenson was not handled very well, was quite insensitive. And Carrie's right. The families have been talked to, not with. In fact, right after the press conference, family members came out and said they felt re-traumatized, and they also felt that there was no inclusion to their opinions. You know, the key is here that we're talking about human beings. We're talking about human remains. But of course, we are talking about Indigenous women and girls. So naturally, we live in a society that has perpetrated an incredible genocide against Indigenous women and girls. And further adding to that is the lack of politicians. In fact, in many ways, this is the cause of much of this, is the lack of willpower by politicians, by institutions, by leaders in society to deal with this issue seriously, to put all the chips in the middle and commit to the 231 calls for justice of the Murdered Missing Indigenous Women and Girls inquiry, beyond just the basic premises of trying. We need to try to search for these human remains of our sisters and our aunties, because they are all of our relatives, not just Indigenous relatives. They are of all of us here in Manitoba. So I'm kind of speechless by the whole past 24 hours of witnessing this, but at the same time, not very surprised, because this is the way Indigenous women and girls are treated all the time.
Well, Niigaan, Carrie, thank you so much for taking some time to talk to us. We'll have to leave it there.
Miigwech.
We have to take one final break here, but our photo of the day and weather are coming up.
And we'll have more details on federal funding announced for the North American Indigenous Games. Stay with us.
Now for our photo of the day. This pair of twin eagles hanging out along the Skeena River in British Columbia was sent to us by Clarence Jones from the Gitxsan Nation. Thanks for sharing. Send your photos to share@aptn.ca to be featured as our next photo of the day. Now let's take a look at tomorrow's weather forecast.
And starting on the East Coast, we've got St. John's at 21, Charlottetown 28. Nain is 12, La Grande River 22. Chibougamau 24, Val-d'Or 26. Peterborough is 25, Toronto also 25. Kapuskasing is 16 and cloudy. Cloudy and 14 in Churchill. Thompson has some moisture at 18. Barons River is cloudy and 23. Gimli, sunny and 25. Saskatoon is sunny and 28. Regina, cloudy and 28 as well. Stony Rapids is 19, and further north, 21 at Uranium City. Northern Alberta, we're looking at high level at 32, Grand Prairie 28. To the south, Calgary's 29, Medicine Hat and Lethbridge at 31. British Columbia, Kamloops is 34, Bella Coola 29. Heading north, we've got Dease Lake at 29 and Smithers 31. Rock River is 19 and Mayo 26. Wrigley is 34 and Fort Simpson 31. And Sax Harbor 15 and Colville Lake 30. Baker Lake is 12 and Cambridge Bay is 11. And Arctic Bay is 10 and Iqaluit is 9.
Well, you're really natural on the weather, Leanne. It was a good update, so thanks for that. The federal government recently announced more than $9 million in funding for the upcoming North American Indigenous Games in Halifax, Nova Scotia.
Nova Scotia Liberal MP Jaime Batiste was there and joined our Dennis Ward to discuss the funding.
Mr. Batiste, appreciate you taking some time for us today. Can you tell us what you anticipate this money might be used for?
Well, the North American Indigenous Games is going to bring in 6,000 athletes from all across North America, Indigenous athletes. The $9 million that we've announced today is part of the overall contribution of the federal government towards this. It's taking care of the accommodations for the athletes, the cultural events that we're having, a lot of the events, a lot of the costs in which for the athletes, some of the elders that are coming in. It's basically also to make sure that we kept the games running. It was originally supposed to go in 2020, but because of the pandemic, we had to put it off. And so this is part of the overall contributions to the federal government to ensuring that NAG is a successful event in Halifax.
Well, I'm excited for NAG, and I'm in Winnipeg, and I believe this is the first time it's being held in Atlantic Canada. So how exciting is that for the region?
It's very exciting. And actually, I was my first North American Indigenous Games that I went to was in Winnipeg in 2002 as a basketball player.
Nice.
And I saw how great it was there, just the amount of pride and the amount of people all in one area. But for the Atlantic, we've been really trying to bring North American Indigenous Games as a dream for at least 10 years now. So for us, it's an amazing thing to have this many Indigenous athletes coming into Halifax and to be taking part in all of the events, the athletic events from lacrosse to fastball to basketball, but also the cultural music. You get to get a little bit of the flavor of the Mi'kmaq culture and music that we're very well known for. And so it's just an exciting time for athletes, exciting time for the coaches. And I can tell from the announcement today just how anxious people are to get it underway.
Well, as somebody who was a former competitor in the games, why do you think it's important to support Indigenous youth in sports competitions like this one?
Well, I think that we've seen, this is part of the Truth and Reconciliation calls to action. Four of the calls to action, 87 to 91, are all talking about Indigenous sports. And I think Willie Littlechild was really influential in that part, and just saying, when we're teaching sports, you learn so much about teamwork, you learn so much about who you are, you learn so much about overcoming adversity. And as Indigenous youth in communities, it's really important to give Indigenous youth that sense of team, that sense of, if we work hard in something that we're going to achieve. And I think that I've learned so much in my life as a result of sports, just in terms of, how to be a better person. And I think the sports, especially team sports, teaches you all kinds of amazing things. And I think that's why a major reason why it's integral to the Truth and Reconciliation's calls to action. A big part of this is promotion of sports and athletics.
Well, I'm sure you'll be attending or at least watching part of the games. Any sports that you'll be watching a little bit more closely?
You know what? The Mi'kmaq are really fond of their fastball. We've got fastball tournaments. That's a whip pitch with the softballs. The lacrosse, I was a former lacrosse player. I'm definitely going to be there. I'm looking forward to it. You couldn't keep me away from there. I know that we got members of parliament coming from all across Canada to be a part of this. They're excited for it, and we just can't wait for the games to get underway.
Me either. MP Padiste, appreciate you taking the time for us here to talk about this.
Appreciate you having me.
I'm certainly looking forward to the games. There's always great competition and sportsmanship.
Well, when was your first games?
1993 in Prince Albert.
Oh, wow. So that would have been just after they started then, hey?
And I think very soon after.
Well, I'm lucky enough to be able to be going to the games to cover it, and I know I'm really looking forward to that. My first time out on the East Coast, so it should be a great time for everybody there, and especially for the athletes. That is all we have for you tonight. I'm Daryl Stranger. Thank you so much for joining us. Miigwech Kinanasmatan.
And I'm Leanne Sanders. Have a great night.
度过这个